As I walked through the gates of the administration building in Jefferson City, the first thing that struck me wasn't the history. It was the weight in the air. Heavy, suffocating, as if the stone walls themselves still clung to the violence, the fear, and the echoes of screams. For nearly 170 years, this place was known as one of the most brutal prisons ever to exist in the United States, and I am going to tell you why. There was always something, and it is no wonder why Time magazine coined the penitentiary as the bloodiest 47 acres in America. So let's take a walk through a place that made Alcatraz look like a day at the races. What was happening on the grounds of the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1836? Front Hall, or Hall A, was the first building to be constructed at the site. There are no official renderings of that building that I could find. However, I imagine that it may have looked similar to this. Constructed out of Missouri limestone, the building was assembled by inmates. The cells were likely small, narrow. It no longer exists today. Prisoners did time at MSP for 70 years before Alcatraz became a federal penitentiary. Today, A Hall is the oldest building at the site, and one of the oldest surviving prison buildings west of the Mississippi River. In fact, it is older than the Missouri State Capitol itself. Well, what was called the first Capitol, a modest limestone and brick building. The warden's house was built in 1887 through 1888, primarily with inmate labor and materials quarried right from the prison grounds. The architect credited for the major redesign is M. Fred Bell of Fulton, Missouri. The house underwent a significant update in 1907, which infused Queen Anne-style elements. According to one source, the first warden to move in was Colonel Darwin W. Marmaduke in 1888, which gave rise to the local nickname. What else was happening in the country in 1836? Andrew Jackson was finishing his presidency, and Martin Van Buren was elected as the 8th president in November 1836. Arkansas was admitted as the 25th state, and the Republic of Texas was formed. Those were the positive developments, but there was considerable conflict throughout the country that was occurring in parallel. Missouri expanded its territory through the Platte Purchase, which involved acquiring land from Native American tribes, a tragic incident in St. Louis near what would soon become the old courthouse, the lynching of African-American Francis McIntosh, a riverboat deckhand. He was unduly detained. Shortly after, a mob pulled him from jail, where he was then tied to a tree and burned alive before a crowd of people. Abraham Lincoln took note of it and indirectly referred to it in his well-known Lyceum address. The Battle of the Alamo was raging. The Trail of Tears was underway in Alabama, following the Indian Removal Act of 1836, and the Second Seminole War was just getting started. Over time, MSP built its reputation the old-fashioned way, through blood and horror. The place was a constant pressure cooker, overcrowding, disease, and endless fights. Inmates ran their own little kingdoms, and if you crossed the wrong guy, well, let's just say you'd better have made peace with your maker. Imagine trying to sleep in a 5 by 7 foot box with another man breathing down your neck, knowing that tomorrow he might stab you with a toothbrush sharpened to a point. Sweet dreams. Other areas of the prison had larger cells, 12 foot by 9 foot, but they held 7 or more, which was over twice as many as they were supposed to. The Missouri State Penitentiary was sometimes called a prison within a city because of its many factories and workshops. Inmates worked in state-run industries that both supplied the prison itself and generated revenue. Over the years, MSP housed a shoe factory, one of the largest prison industries, producing footwear for both prisoners and outside contracts. A clothing factory. Inmates made uniforms, denim work clothes, and sometimes military garments during wartime. A furniture factory. Produced wooden furniture, including desks, chairs, and institutional furnishings for state buildings. For decades, Missouri's license plates were stamped inside MSP, a tobacco factory. Rolling and packaging cigarettes was a prison industry for many years. A saddle and harness shop. Leatherwork was a major trade. A broom factory. Prisoners handmade brooms and brushes for state and commercial sale. And there were many other factories and shops, like printing, mattress making, and even a chemical plant used for soap and disinfectants, and much more. The factories were part of the Missouri Prison Industries, MPI system, intended to keep inmates busy, provide job training, and offset prison costs. In practice, the work was grueling, often unsafe, and became part of the prison's reputation for harshness. In the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, recreation was making its way to the penitentiary. It was not just about exercise, it was a tool for discipline and rehabilitation. Keeping men occupied meant fewer riots and less violence. Baseball became legendary at MSP, with games drawing big crowds inside and outside the walls. Organized boxing and wrestling matches drew prisoners and local interest alike. Roller skating, mini-golf, weightlifting, judo, and even a prison band were popular. For example, the Peaceful Village Band, Harry Snodgrass. Snodgrass was received into MSP on June 11, 1923, to serve a 3-year sentence. He was from St. Louis, Missouri, and had a relatively modest educational background, 7th grade, when he came into MSP. Once in prison, his musical talent, especially at the piano, was discovered, and he was assigned to play in the prison's band as part of the inmate music program. A Hall, the oldest building at the penitentiary, and very segregated. A Hall functioned as a segregated housing unit for black prisoners during the era of Jim Crow, roughly from the late 1800s through the early 1960s. Segregation in A Hall was lengthy and dreadful. Black men were placed almost exclusively in A Hall. This applied not only to living quarters, but also to work assignments and recreational access, which were restricted to separate areas and had fewer opportunities. Cells were tiny, dark, and oppressive, and inmates were allowed out only briefly, if at all. A Hall became notorious for this kind of punishment, and that's why it's so frequently mentioned on tours and in memoirs. Civil Rights Era, 1960s. With federal pressure and changing laws, Missouri began dismantling segregation inside its prison system. By the mid-1960s, MSP officially ended the practice of keeping A Hall black only. Integration was slow, but by the 1970s, prisoners were no longer housed strictly by race. I can't wait to tell you about the painted cells in A Hall. Before I do, I would like to ask you to consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel. It's fun and keeps me motivated to create more epic adventures. My passion is storytelling and bringing interesting and little-known topics to you. Okay, now for the paintings. At one point, officials allowed prisoners in A Hall to paint their own cells. This occurred around the 1960s to 1970s, during a period when prison administrators were experimenting with ways to improve morale and reduce violence. The reasoning was partly psychological. Giving inmates some choice and creativity was thought to reduce tensions. It was also a form of behavioral incentive. Better behaved prisoners could personalize their otherwise grim cells. Some men painted murals, landscapes, or just added color to break up the monotony of concrete and iron. It was one of the few small freedoms allowed in a place defined by total control. Many were creative, but I visited one that the inmate chose to paint all black, even his window. There were countless inmates who spent hard time over the lifespan of the Missouri State Penitentiary. Some of those would be released to live quiet, honest lives, while others would go on to offend again, sending them back to their cramped cells. Others didn't have a chance of leaving and would meet the fate of the gallows, cyanide gas chamber, or lethal injection. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd disliked the nickname tied to his looks and charm. In 1925, at age 21, he robbed a Kroger grocery store in St. Louis and was sentenced to 5 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary. While inside, he kept quiet, polite, and out of trouble, serving about 4 years before his release in 1929. Freedom didn't steer him straight. He returned to Oklahoma and quickly escalated from small-time robberies to becoming one of the Depression-era's most notorious bank robbers. His time at MSP did little to reform him, instead hardening his ties to crime. In 1933, he was implicated in the Kansas City massacre, where 4 lawmen were killed, making him a prime FBI target. Federal agents fatally shot him in Ohio in 1934. Sonny Liston was sentenced to 5 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary for armed robbery in St. Louis. While incarcerated, a Catholic priest introduced him to boxing, where his raw power and heavy hands quickly stood out. Released in 1952, Liston transformed from inmate to rising fighter, eventually becoming the world heavyweight champion. Ironically, prison was the place that launched his fame. James Earl Ray was serving time at the Missouri State Penitentiary for burglary, armed robbery, and forgery when he used his prison bakery job to learn the routine of delivery trucks. On April 23, 1967, he hid inside a Wren's Correctional Farm bread truck and escaped undetected. Less than a year later, on April 4, 1968, he assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, fled the country under aliases, but was captured at London's Heathrow Airport and sentenced to 99 years at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. In 1977, Ray and 6 others escaped Brushy by sawing through a window and scaling the wall with a rope ladder, but he was recaptured in the nearby mountains 5 days later. Blanche Caldwell Barrow, wife of Buck Barrow, was a reluctant member of the Barrow Gang. She was injured in a gunfight in Platte City in 1933, which left her blind in one eye, and she was apprehended shortly thereafter. She was the sole female member of the gang who stood trial, receiving a 10-year sentence but serving 6 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary, where she earned a reputation as an exemplary inmate until her release in 1939. Blanche later lived quietly in Oklahoma and worked to set the record straight about her life, pushing back against the wild, exaggerated image created by the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde. Firebug Johnson was incarcerated at MSP in the 1880s. Initially, he wound up here for robbing an acquaintance of $10, about $320 in 2026 terms. During his stay at MSP, Johnson attempted to escape 3 times. His third escape attempt, in February 1883, involved setting a fire in the prison's factory, which quickly spread and caused significant damage. As a result, he was convicted of arson in a Cole County court and received an additional 12-year sentence, and was also punished by the MSP staff on February 26, 1883, for starting the fire, for which he was to spend, sometimes chained up, 17 years in solitary confinement in a part of the prison known as the dungeon, a tiny, pitch-black cell deep underground with minimal human contact, no pillow, blanket, or other comforts, and nothing to sleep on but a cold Missouri limestone floor until his release in July 1900. There were countless inmates who were feared by those serving time for one reason or another. Few captures MSP's brutality like Claude McGee. Just look at what 2 years of serving time at MSP can do to a guy. Claude McGee wasn't a celebrity criminal. He was not robbing banks, and he didn't have Hollywood looks. Because of a combination of murder, extreme violence, escaping prior convictions, mental health issues, and a particularly gruesome claw-hammer killing inside the prison, his name often comes up as one of the most feared. So, about those dungeons. The dungeons at the Missouri State Penitentiary were some of the most feared spaces in the entire prison. They were located in the basement of A Hall, and conditions were brutal. The cells were windowless stone vaults built underground. Once the heavy iron doors shut, prisoners were left in pitch black. Inmates slept on the cold limestone floor. There were no toilets, just buckets, at best, which might sit for weeks or more. Prisoners were sometimes shackled to the walls or floors, left standing or crouched in painful positions for long stretches. No contact, no sound but the echo of one's own breath. Other notable inmates who spent long periods in the dungeon. James Anderson, found guilty of murder in the mid-1800s, he was reported to have spent years in the dungeon due to repeated violent behavior. During the 1860s, captured Confederate guerrillas and Union deserters were kept in the dungeons. Conditions were so severe that some met their demise there because of the long confinement. By the early 1900s, the dungeons were considered inhumane, but they were still used as punishment until well into the 20th century. Former inmates described time spent there as the worst part of prison life. Some lost their sanity, and others emerged nearly blind. But then came the big one, the riots of September 1954. 2,500 inmates, already at the boiling point, finally erupt. Fires light up the night sky, prisoners run wild, and guards are outnumbered. Chaos ruled while 18 prisoners escaped, and few, if any, black prisoners took part in the riot. After fires broke out and inmates seized parts of the yard, officials rounded up suspected ringleaders once the National Guard regained control. By the end, 4 inmates were dead and dozens were wounded. This cemented MSP's savage reputation nationwide. But that would not be the last riot. Another broke out in September 1964 with about 2,000 inmates. They started several fires, causing significant destruction, and the Missouri National Guard was once again called in to restore order. This was not the end of the dungeons either. Once the National Guard regained control, officials rounded up suspected ringleaders and threw them into the dungeons. Some of these men were chained and kept in there for weeks while investigations played out. Eyewitness accounts from guards confirmed that dungeon confinement was used as a post-riot punishment. The gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary was constructed in 1937. It is a small, windowless, concrete block building explicitly built for executions. Inside, it holds a steel chamber with 2 seats. Beneath the chair was a bucket or well filled with sulfuric acid. When the executioner pulled the lever, a small container of cyanide pellets, often potassium cyanide, dropped into the acid beneath the prisoner, which produced deadly gas. After the condemned was declared dead, the exhaust fans were switched on. These pulled the cyanide gas out of the steel chamber and expelled it through a ventilation stack, similar to a chimney, on the outside of the small concrete building. It was stark, utilitarian, and built for one purpose only: to carry out Missouri's death sentences in a cold, efficient, and controlled environment. Visitors have described an overwhelming sense of dread, with some claiming to hear coughing or choking sounds. The first execution by gas took place in 1938. Roscoe "Red" Jackson. He was convicted of murdering a police officer in St. Louis. Was it a rough way to die? Absolutely. Cyanide gas executions were notorious for their violent physical reactions and the visible suffering of the prisoner. Cyanide blocks the body's ability to use oxygen, essentially causing internal suffocation while oxygen is still present in the blood. While this gas chamber has 2 chairs, they were only used in conjunction on a single occasion. Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie B. Hetty were executed together on December 18, 1953, following their conviction for the kidnapping and murder of Bobby Greenlease Jr., a young boy from Kansas City. Public opinion would later turn against the method, and lethal injection eventually replaced it nationwide. The Missouri State Penitentiary is widely regarded as one of the most haunted locations in the Midwest. After more than 170 years of violence, executions, riots, and human suffering, many believe the prison never truly emptied when it closed. Visitors and staff have reported disembodied voices echoing through the cell blocks, shadow figures moving in empty corridors, sudden cold spots, and unexplained footsteps. Some have claimed to feel overwhelming dread or anger in certain areas, as if an emotional imprint of inmates and guards still lingers within the stone walls. Over 10 years ago, I was alone in A Hall and heard several loud metallic bangs down the tier. It sounded intentional, as if it was trying to get my attention. As I walked to investigate, the sounds continued, getting louder as I approached the end cell, where I believed was the source. As I entered the cell, I was met with nothing but silence. Nothing was out of place or unusual. While filming from a top-tier cell in A Hall, looking across the breezeway toward Building 5, I noticed movement inside a small, white rooftop structure. The building was locked and should have been empty, yet something shifted, as if watching me, before quickly hiding. I didn't realize what I had captured until I later reviewed the footage. Once the oldest continually operating prison west of the Mississippi, the Missouri State Penitentiary ran for 168 years before closing in 2004. Today, it stands as a historic landmark in downtown Jefferson City, Missouri, drawing thousands of visitors from around the world each year. As I walked out of the prison, I realized this wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing monument to human reform, cruelty, survival, and violence. For nearly 2 centuries, this place defined punishment in Missouri. It was called the bloodiest 47 acres in America. And after hearing the stories of riots, escapes, and men like Claude McGee, I get it. This wasn't just a prison. It was a world all its own. A world built on blood, sweat, and fear. And now, all that remains are the walls, the cells, and the memories of men who never walked back out. I am not associated with the Missouri State Penitentiary in any way, but I do encourage you to visit the site and experience the magic that only exists in person. Visitors have the option to explore both the prison and the warden's residence, which was constructed by inmates, and includes a museum dedicated to the Missouri State Penitentiary. All of this and more, right in the heart of downtown Jefferson City, Missouri. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel. It's fun and keeps me motivated to create more epic adventures. My passion is storytelling and bringing interesting and little-known topics to you. Thank you very much for watching this video.